I've been running my Home Assistant Blue for 6 or 7 months now. I've got all my production integrations and add-ons that I run on a daily basis running on that device. So I want to give you a little tour of what I run, and in the end, give you a little bit of an overview of the loading that is running on that system with everything up and going. So let's get started. So obviously we always start with my dashboard. This is my main dashboard that I run on here, and it encompasses pretty much every device that I'm running on my Home Assistant Blue. There may be a few exceptions, but most of it is here. So what powers all of this right here? Let's go into the add-ons section and take a look at what we're running from there first. Now, keep in mind that there's integrations, core integrations, there's add-ons, and then there's HACS, Home Assistant Community Store. I'm running all of those things together to build out my production system. So under Supervisor, we'll look at the add-ons section. And this section here shows what I'm running on this device right now. So under AdGuard Home, that's my DNS server. And I run my DNS server for my entire internal network using AdGuard Home, and it's all running as primary on this Home Assistant Blue. I do have a secondary AdGuard instance that I don't run all the time because it's not needed, number one, but if I have to, I can turn it on, and my DNS settings or DHCP settings for my devices automatically pick up the second DNS server. But under AdGuard Home, it has a nice little UI that you can use on it. It gives you a lot of statistics, and it gives you the ability to control things such as filters, DNS rewrites, block services, things like that. And then you can get a query log if you want to see what's going on. None of this video today is a deep dive into any of these applications or add-ons. It's just talking about what I run. But you can see here that I'm running about, I've run in the last 7 days, 533,961 queries, and I've blocked 39% of those. And so it's not trivial. It's working and doing stuff, and it works quickly, and I don't notice any lag when I'm running this against my Home Assistant Blue. Next up, I run Duck DNS. That's a free dynamic DNS service that allows me to talk back to my Home Assistant instance using a Duck DNS domain. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on a lot of these applications. I just want to give you a quick tour of what I'm running here. I also run ESP Home. ESP Home allows me to control and update all of my ESP devices that I have around the house. Now, I've got a few more of these that are running on my test system that don't show up here, but it gives you a good way to play with the ESP devices. And one of them here is this ESP8266. I run that ESP8266 and a bunch of ESP32 devices, and I control those all via ESP Home. Next up is File Editor, and this is just simply a way for me to edit files on the system. So I can go into this system and I can do any kind of file editing real quick on the fly without having to go in and load up something like Visual Studio Code or SSH to the box, which we don't really do anyway. And then just do some quick editing for things I need to work on. So it's a very quick, easy way to do that. It doesn't run all the time. It's up and running, but I don't use it all the time. So it's not one of those things that continuously creates load. This is probably the biggest loaded device on here, my Frigate NVR. And I have 4 videos on it or 5 videos on it now. And it's a full NVR system. And I use this to look at security throughout my entire house or entire property area. And it just runs 24/7. It records one of my cameras 24/7. It does object detection for the rest of my cameras 24/7. And I've got 5 cameras running. So this, again, is by far the biggest loading device on the system, and we'll be able to see some of this stuff later on. Next up is Glances. This is not running all the time. Glances is kind of a load monitoring system for your device. If you're a Linux admin or something like that, it's equivalent to Top, or maybe it even runs Top. But it gives you a line-by-line view of all the loading on your system. And we may fire that up here in a few minutes to kind of look at what we're running on the system. But right now it doesn't run because it seems to provide a little bit extra load that I don't need. And I only bring it up whenever I need to. And next up is Grafana. And I run Grafana as a way to graph all of my data that I'm interested in watching over time. For example, my eco weather here is one of them. You've seen a lot of these videos where I talk about Grafana and what I do with it. A lot of environment stuff. One of my latest videos was looking at some power monitoring or some temperature monitoring for my power radio systems. And then now I've added some voltage monitoring to that as well. But Grafana is a very nice way to visualize all of your data that you have running in your system. Next up is InfluxDB, and InfluxDB is actually a way to store the data that I'm getting in Grafana. So this is how I use Grafana, or this is where I store time-based data from Home Assistant into Grafana. And it has a nice web interface as well that allows you to explore and do other things like admin the DB and do some configuration work. Again, more so storage than maybe CPU usage is what this takes. So I've got Let's Encrypt here, but I don't run that because I'm letting DuckDNS handle that. Also, I'm letting Nginx Proxy Manager handle the Let's Encrypt. So it's there, but it's not actually running. MariaDB is also here. MariaDB is necessary for some add-ons that require it. So I'm running MariaDB. And by the way, each one of these things, you can see how much RAM and how much CPU usage these are using as you open the supervisor view of these things. But right now you can see it's very little, it doesn't do anything at all, hardly. And then Mosquito Broker. Mosquito Broker is a pretty big one for me. All of my Tasmota devices and a number of my other devices talk back to Home Assistant via MQTT. You can use this MQTT broker with non-Home Assistant devices or anything else that talks MQTT. What this broker does is creates an MQTT broker on your network that allows you to use it for whatever purposes you need it for. Again, not a lot of CPU usage or RAM usage for this actual add-on, but it does do a lot of work and it does read a lot of data in all the time. Using something like MQTT Explorer, for example, you can see how much stuff is coming in on a real-time basis. Nginx Proxy Manager is another add-on that I use on a regular basis. It allows me to talk to my Home Assistant remotely. I do use Nabu-Casa, by the way, as well, but I use this to be able to talk to my Home Assistant. Plus, with the Proxy Manager, I can also talk to some other hosts that I have inside of my network via a single 443 or SSL-based input. And you can see that I have 3 proxy hosts here currently, and my SSL certificates are managed by by Nginx Proxy Manager. That's why I'm not using Let's Encrypt, because the Proxy Manager has it built into it. So this is a cool and neat tool you can use as well. A lot of these I have videos on, so if you're interested in how I've set this up, go back and check my video list and you'll see these listed there. So let's go look at what's next here. Node-RED. Node-RED is a huge one for me. Node-RED uses about 3.2% RAM and about 1.8% CPU. So looking at the web UI for Node-RED, this is where I do a lot of my automation. This is a lot of automation work that I did prior to having the newer versions of Home Assistant where the UI allows better and more capable automations to be done quickly. But I do a lot of things with my Nest equipment, my lights, alarm panels, door actions, fridge monitoring, motion monitoring, all kinds of stuff here. So Node-RED is a very, very big part of what I do. It runs most of my automations right now. And so it's a very vital function to be operating all the time. All right, Samba Backup is something else that I run. And I run this on a daily basis, and you can look at the configuration options for this. But what it does is it takes my Home Assistant, creates a snapshot, and puts it back onto my network attached storage via a mount point. And that's very crucial if you want to make sure that you're able to restore from an outage or something. Make sure that you're running the Samba backup there. All right, what's next here? All right, so we have Samba Share. Now, I use this Samba Share actually to be able to connect to Home Assistant via something like Visual Studio Code or something else. The Samba Share is important so that I can use those tools without having to get into Home Assistant. I can actually make modifications to my configuration files directly through something like Visual Studio Code or some other editor that's on my Windows boxes around my network. but this is the handy tool to have. You can see here 0.3% RAM usage and 0% CPU. So it's really not doing much right now. A lot of these things you see are not doing things all the time. So you can load up a bunch of stuff on your Home Assistant device, especially the Blue, or maybe even a Raspberry Pi or something like that, and still have it available to use, even though you're not using it all the time. Now, Tailscale I'm using as a zero config VPN setup, and this is running on my system from time to time. Now, I don't have it running right now, but I do turn it on, and it's very minimal in terms of what it uses. I have a video on the Tailscale stuff if you want to watch that. Tasmo Admin, I leave this off because it gets noisy on my network. More than the Blue, having issues with the Blue, it gets noisy on my network. So I leave it off, but when I need to do some work with my Tasmo devices, I'll start it up and I'll look at the listing of my Tasmatized devices, and then I can modify or configure those or do whatever else with those. Tasmo Backup does run on a regular basis. I back up my Tasmo devices daily, and you can see here the latest backups were a couple days ago, or yesterday. I guess it'll run at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I run all of these as backups into my Home Assistant folder, and that way, if I lose a Tasmo device, I can come back and restore it from the backup. So this runs all the time. This hardly uses any bit of CPU or RAM either. So that's very minimal. I also run I can't say it, but Tautuli. This is a front end for Plex, my Plex media server, which is not running on my Blue. My Plex media server runs on a standalone, or it runs on a different PC. But anyway, it allows you to monitor and do stuff with your Plex instance. It runs about 0.8% CPU usage. Now, if I open this in a new tab, one thing I noticed with this right here is it doesn't seem to update unless you get off the page and go back. So this is not real-time updating of your RAM or CPU usage. It's a snapshot in time, at least what I've seen. And this is kind of the Tautuli interface that you can use for this. But even with the web interface, it's not doing a lot of usage of RAM or anything else. All right, so terminal SSH, that's important. That allows me to get into a terminal, so I can actually come over here and pull up a terminal and get onto Home Assistant proper through an SSH terminal if there's anything I need to do within the actual Home Assistant system itself. And what else here? We have the Unify controller. Now, I was running the Unify controller on my Home Assistant Blue, but I started to see a pretty big spike in memory usage from the Unify controller. I just went ahead and ran that on a different computer in my network because I don't want to lose control of my network if something happens to the Blue. That was probably the second biggest user of resources behind Frigate. And I just wasn't able to do both of those for whatever reason. That controller just started sucking a lot of memory. So I went ahead and moved it. So it's not running. It ran for a very long time on here, and then an update just kind of caused some sort of issue with it. All right, what else we have? Vault Warden. I use Vault Warden extensively. I run it on multiple devices, multiple PCs. It is my new password manager. I've been running it for probably a couple of years now. I've got a video on Bitwarden, which used to be called Bitwarden. Now it's called Vault Warden. 0.7% on the RAM usage, 0 on the CPU usage, so not a lot there. WireGuard, I use WireGuard and Tailscale. Now, WireGuard is how I ingress into my network, as well as using Tailscale. It's a backup that I use to Tailscale now, just in case I can't get through and do what's called a subnet router on Tailscale, where I can reach my devices inside my network. WireGuard is a backup to that. It's not a high resource usage. And then Z-Wave to Z-Wave.js to MQTT add-on. Now, this one, of course, my network is mostly Z-Wave. And so this is a big one for me. This add-on allows me to talk to my different devices within my network, provides a nice front end for all of my configuration. But anyway, this is what it is, and it's used for controlling my Z-Wave stuff through a nice web UI. And I really like it. 2.5% on the RAM and 0.5% on the CPU. Now, those are all the core add-ons that I run within Home Assistant. There's also a ton of integrations that I run as well. And some of those are based on these add-ons, and some of those are based on HACS stuff that I do. Now, the integrations are found under Configuration Integrations. And we'll just kind of go through these quickly. I'm not going to go bring up a bunch of web pages for these, but just to give you an idea what runs on the blue here. Again, AdGuard is an integration to Home Assistant. Now, a lot of these add-ons allow you to also integrate them into Home Assistant. So you can have a web UI for them, which the add-on provides, and then they get integrated to Home Assistant via this integrations panel here. Ambient weather station, my printer. I've got some ClimaCell stuff for weather. My EcoWit, where I do my weather monitoring, is an integration that I run. My Emporia view is my energy monitoring, and I made a nice video on that, and also on the EcoWit. ESP Home is an integration, and it brings in all of these ESP devices into Home Assistant so I can read these and get data from those. My Flume water device is here. My Frigate integration, Google Cast, HACS allows me to run HACS in Home Assistant. My Home Assistant supervisor has 26 services, 78 entities. Again, my printer, another secondary internet printing protocol. Keymaster controls my front and back door locks. My application for my Home Assistant app on my phone is here. My Mosquito Broker integration to the National Weather Service here in the US. My Nest configuration. And then we have OwnTracks, which is kind of a location tracking service. My Ratio sprinkler controller. My Roku's in the house. My Shelly smart home stuff. I've got a speedtest.net integration. My Synology NAS is integrated here. And then, of course, I've got Tasmoda, my Unify controller. Now, Unify controller runs on a different server, but the integration that allows Home Assistant to see devices in my Unify network is an integration here. My WebRTC camera allows me to view WebRTC streams from my cameras. And then my Z-Wave JS is my big Z-Wave integration. Those are all the devices that I run on Home Assistant and all my integrations. Now, anything HACS related, which is the Home Assistant Community Store, has an integration if it works with Home Assistant. So you saw that in the integrations pane. But if we look at HACS here, and we look at integrations, we can come down to the bottom of this list, and we can look at some of the integrations I'm running here. I've got HACS itself, the WebRTC camera, EcoWit, weather alerts, mail and packages, Keymaster, Sonoff, Entity Controller, Shelly, Frigate, and Emporia View. Now, these are all things that are integrated from custom integrations that are built out by the Home Assistant users in the community, not the Home Assistant core developers, and they're added into Home Assistant. Now, let's take a quick look. I'm going to go back over to my supervisor page, and I want to show you, we're going to start up glances. I'm going to show you what the loading is on the Home Assistant Blue with everything running. And again, Frigate's going to be a big part of it, and that'll be the top user of my resources on this device. Now, I wouldn't be able to run Frigate without running a Coral TPU. I can't put 5 cameras on my Frigate or on my Home Assistant Blue without running something like a Coral Tensor Processing Unit or TensorFlow Processing Unit, because it just doesn't have the ability to run all of that. Okay, so here is glances at a glance. You can see what I did there. So we're currently running at 33.1% CPU, 62.1% or 61% memory, and then 99% swap. On a Unix-based system, swap is almost always maxed out. It's just the way it is. It's measured maxed out. It's not a big issue for it to be maxed out like that. You're concerned with your CPU and your memory totals, and you can see that here as you watch what's going on. Now we can see what's running. In addition to this totals, we can see what's running here. And you can see right away that Frigate is running 119% CPU. Now, when you're looking at these numbers, you really have to understand how this thing measures. And I'm not going to go into full detail on how it works. There's a lot of theory behind these measurements. You're not going to get 119% CPU usage, but your measurement's going to show that briefly as it spikes up and then drops back down. This is updating, I think, every 5 seconds or 10 seconds. I'm not sure exactly what. But you can see as it changes what goes on here. And even Frigate drops down a little bit, but it's still by far the biggest user of CPU. And it's also looking like it's the biggest user of memory, and that is to be expected. It is processing object detection 24/7 for 5 cameras. I've never noticed any kind of issues with the Blue running this setup that I'm running now. And you can see here why we have this thing with glances. I don't run it all the time because it's sitting here and it's running at 13%. And I don't like it using that much CPU when I'm not looking at it. So I turn it off in between. But some of the big users here, Home Assistant core itself is using 21% CPU and about 700 or 600 meg of memory. Frigate, it's the biggest one. And then we have really Influx for memory purposes is the biggest one. And you'll see things spike through here as processes run and as things occur. For example, Frigate changes because when it's looking at motion detection, it only starts doing some of its processing whenever there's motion detection. And it'll spike up when there's an activity on a camera. On cloudy days or partly cloudy days when the sun is going in and out of the clouds, you'll see a lot of activity on Frigate because it's doing a lot of processing to understand whether or not that motion is actually an object or not. But you can see here, we've got a couple of CPU I/O weight issues from time to time and some memory swap issues. But overall, I've never had any issues with the Blue running this kind of setup all the time, every day, 24/7. So the Blue is very powerful when it comes to being able to run a decent sized Home Assistant setup with a lot of add-ons and a lot of integrations. The idea today in the video, of course, is just to talk about what I'm running and give you a good indication of how much stuff you can put on a Home Assistant Blue. And then if you take and compare the statistics or the processing and CPU or the CPU and memory of a Raspberry Pi 4, for example, to the Blue, you're going to have a little bit more power in the Blue, but you can take away a few of these add-ons here and still run a decent Home Assistant setup on a Raspberry Pi. So if you've ever wondered, what do I need to run Home Assistant? Get yourself an Odroid N2 Plus, which is what the Blue is based off of, or a Home Assistant Blue. The new Amber's coming out. That'll be something we'll have to play around with and see how much power it has to be able to run some of the stuff we've got here. But just a quick overview of what I'm running on my Home Assistant Blue, a tour, just to give you all an idea what's possible with it, and then kind of what I run as well. So if you have any questions, put those down below in the comments or ask me in Discord. My Discord link is down below as well. If you're not a channel member, I encourage you to join, help support the channel. Be a subscriber if you're not a subscriber. Hit the like button if you like the video, and we will see you on the next one.